A crash can be devastating, but if you're lucky enough to survive, well, the devastation can continue. We're going to talk about that and what can be done in the hangar. Hey everyone, Dan Milliken here, and I want to welcome you to In the Hangar, and I want to thank our sponsors. The links are down there in the description. Make sure you check it out. One of our favorite guests here on In the Hangar is Joe Casey. Joe, thanks for being on.
Thank you, Dan. Good to be here.
We're going to talk about something that's going to be kind of hard for me. We're going to talk about crashes. A lot of people kind of know, and a lot of people don't. I crashed recently in a gyrocopter, and it was pretty traumatic. It was probably the most traumatic thing I've ever been through. And one of the kind of turning moments in that whole psychological effect after the crash was when I called you. And, you know, what you said just really had a huge impact on me. And because, well, first of all, you know, after a crash, you doubt yourself heavily. And I didn't even ask you for this, but the first thing you said on the phone was, Dan, I'd go fly with you anytime.
And not only I'd go flying with you, but I'd put my loved ones on board with you and let them go flying with you.
You know, and that just floored me. And I said, okay, we need, and you said, we need to talk about crashes. So here we are. Yeah. You said you've had crashes. And, you know, we can talk about what happens from a logistic point of view, and we will maybe about the NTSB and the FAA and all that kind of stuff. But really, it's the emotional stuff that can really have a traumatic difference.
You know, we're all type A personalities, or many of us are. We take our flying very seriously, and one of the things that we all know is if you want to have a career in aviation, they're going to ask you, do you have accident history? And it's sort of like this big weight, or this big A that's put on your chest of, I've had a crash. And our culture of aviation just doesn't look at that well. It's a black mark. And not only that, but it's a black mark upon our psyche. And you know, when you've had a crash, I had a crash a good many years ago, but it probably took me 4 to 5 years before I'd even talk about the crash.
Oh, wow.
But after I began talking about the crash, I began to talk about, people began to come to me and ask about, it was an entree into an area that's very dark for a lot of people. And for my crash, I was landing a PA-46 with my entire family on board at a small field. It was about a 3,000-foot strip, and came in to land. And when I touched down on the runway at appropriate speeds and appropriate everything, my left brake went completely to the floor. No braking whatsoever. And that doesn't sound so bad until you really put the fact that the right brake worked perfectly. Mm. And so the airplane, I've touched down, left brake goes all the way to the floor, right brake works good well, the airplane veers to the right, so I put in left pedal, and I was left with this dance of how much left pedal and how much braking do you do, and you're making all this on the fly, it's on the drive, right, decisions as the runway end is coming closer. And at the end of the flight, I ended up on the very end of the runway, off to the right, hit a ditch, and of course the prop struck, the wing hit a berm that was on the right side of the runway, and here I was, unprepared. I was in a place of, how could this happen? How could I be? How can all the stars align for me to be in the ditch? I'm a good pilot, aren't I? And then you begin to question everything. And for me, the whole process, I literally didn't know what to do. Thank goodness, like so many times that happens whenever you have an accident, somebody shows up that brings other resources to the table. It's amazing how many stories you hear of when somebody's in the ditch or with a bent airplane that somebody else showed up. A guy showed up at this little small airport with a crane of all things. Oh, wow. And we craned, I've got pictures of the airplane being craned up, and got the airplane on its wheels and where it needed to be. But then began the real hard process of notifying the FAA, having an FAA inspector come out, dealing with insurance and all the different things that were going to happen related to that, and then had to deal with my own personal the internal emotions that come from when you're in the ditch. And I learned real quick what needs to be said and what people need to hear. And it became a place of where I initially shut it off, but it wasn't long before I was able to begin to talk to people about it and help people. At the end of my event, I looked at it and said, I had a brake failure. It wasn't my fault. I'm a good pilot. And that's what I would say said for years, because I'm defending this ego that I've got. And we all need to defend that ego to a point. But if I were to look at it with years of retrospection, I didn't check my brakes. It's my fault. And you have to get to a place where you go, was there something I could have done better? And in this case, there was. I will tell you now, a professional pilot will check his brakes every time he lands an airplane, or he or she lands an airplane. It's the hallmark of a good pilot, is to check your brakes prior to landing. Nearly every checklist will say it. And if you have a pressurized airplane, then you definitely need to check the brakes prior to landing. There's not a single landing I make anymore that I don't check my brakes prior to landing. And so there's the thing I did wrong. The one aspect of, and had I checked my brakes and known that I had a left brake failure on a less than 3,000 foot runway, I would have done a missed approach, flown to the big long runway, and we would have never had this discussion. But I made that error. And I had to live with that. But it took a long time to be able to get to that place. And of course, every year you get to revisit that experience, because you get to fill out an insurance form and check that block. And it's just not a comfortable check mark to make. So it was a real challenge. I learned for myself what I had to deal with my own internal stuff, and I began to learn what other people needed. And I think it's important that a person that has been through an accident is willing to talk, and when they're emotionally strong, to be able to talk about it. And I got to a place, and it became one of those things that was really, really good. So,
For me, I kind of wish it was a brake failure. Clearly it was loss of control. It was the pilot's error, 100%. I wish I could point to a mechanical and say, well, or this or that, but it was my fault, and clearly it was my fault. The crazy thing is I really took a lot of baby steps on this flight, because it was a coming out of maintenance flight. I took a lot of steps to prepare for it, and still lost control. So I'm still probably not in a great place on it yet, like you are.
No, well, one of the best healers that's out there is time. And I learned some things from my accident that I think are applicable to other people. One of the things that you'll learn in the world of psychology is that they call it talk therapy. And you just simply need to talk to somebody about it. But it's the last thing you want to do if you're a pilot, is talk about it. Now, let me be real careful. What I don't mean is that somebody needs to go onto a forum
Right.
and shout to the world, here's everything that related to this, and then everybody's going to bombard that, because they don't know the full story. They don't have they don't know the nuances, the little things that happen, and all of a sudden you're getting beat up. I'm not talking about.
Well, and I made that error, and and it was pure ego.
Absolutely.
I get Juan Brown reached out to me, Blanco Lirio, and actually I had let a few people know that in case the NTSB report comes across, they would. And Juan invited me onto the show, and I said, well, let me think about it overnight. And I slept on it, and then made the wrong decision. The next morning, I called him and said, yeah, I'll do it. And it was because of ego, because I wanted to be on the Blanco Lirio show. And in that, I was still probably less than 48 hours after the accident. I did have a minor concussion. I did not need to be going on camera telling the story,
Right.
Because I didn't tell it right. Didn't use the right words and all the kind of stuff.
You weren't mentally and emotionally prepared to do
No.
it. I don't even know that scenario, but I can tell you weren't.
Yeah.
It's a huge event when you have an aircraft crash of any sort, and you survive it. Even if it's a minor one, a nose gear collapse,
Right.
something that's minor, it's a big event. It ended up being that as a flight instructor that's very active, I've instruct probably 600 hours a year, a lot of flight instruction with a lot of different people. I do PA-46 instruction, TBM instruction in higher level airplanes with clients. And I ended up with a high level of clients that would come to me having a story, having something that happened in their past. A lot of times it's something that I, as a flight instructor, need to go kind of figure out what happened, and then we'll go train to those deficiencies. It's I've noticed it's very, very difficult for people to talk about it. What I mean at the end of a crash, part of the healing process is not that you shout it to the world on stage or on a digital stage or on in front of a bunch of people that aren't truly your friends. One of the things that to prepare for a crash or to just prepare for life, you need real friends. And what I mean by this is you're not just talking to people that have no care or have no care about you. You're talking to somebody that's actually going to listen to you. And at the end of that conversation is going to love you and care for you and listen to what you had. And maybe not even judge what happened and tell you all the different aspects of what you did wrong or what you did right, but just somebody that's going to listen to what you had to say. And at the end of that discussion, simply going to say, I understand and I hear you and I love you anyway. I care for you. I care for you even if you messed all this up, because you probably did. There's probably something that you messed up. Having that friend, I mean, we've entered into a society now where we have a gajillion friends on, friends I say in quotes, but we don't have those intimate relationships where we can talk to people about the dirty, dark secrets. And if you have a crash, that's a dirty, dark secret because it's something we don't want to talk about. But I'm telling you right now, having either that person or that close 3 or 4 people, we ought to all have 3 or 4 people that we can go to in confidence. And so you need to have that person. So if you don't have that person and you're listening to this, I hope the people that are here would fight for those relationships, because when you go through an aircraft crash, you're not going to prepare for it. It's not like you planned for that to be the case. But at the end of that, you're going to want that friend that can listen to you. So when you called me, I knew what you wanted. I knew you wanted.
I didn't know what I wanted.
I knew you wanted a friend. And I had flown with you many times prior to this. I knew you were a good pilot. I knew that there was something. I didn't know all the little tiny things, but what I knew at that point when I got to talk to you, and I deeply appreciate you even giving me a call, because what you were saying is I'm a friend. And then we were able to talk on that phone. It was probably an hour-long discussion that we had. But I'd like to think it helped. And I'd like to think that that's one of the aspects that you needed, was somebody just to listen and tell you without judgment and be that friend. Can I give you another thing that you need?
Yeah.
You need to write it out.
Well, we did that on the FAA report.
You do. There is something, I don't know what it is, there is something about writing your story.
Okay.
And literally getting out I don't care if it's a pen and paper or if it's get out your computer. For me, it's a computer, and I'll write my story. But to write that story out while it's fresh in your mind, you're writing yourself a letter is what you're doing.
This is brutally honest. Yeah.
Brutally honest in that letter. You're talking to yourself. No one else is going to read it unless you, a year later, decide that that's a good thing for you to be able to do. And then maybe you'll refine parts of it and do that. I did it. I had another crash. Can I tell you just a little bit about that?
Please do.
I had a total engine failure. Literally, the engine just literally came apart. Oil flew on the screen. I was at 15,000 feet. And it was one of those stories where I did it right, meaning that I got over the airport, I spiraled down through an undercast and popped out at about 1,800 feet and ended up making a nice landing at a little airport. It was one that felt like, man, I did pretty good on this one. I survived it. That was a plus. And but at the end of the whole thing, I felt good enough to be able to write that story. And writing that story was so therapeutic for me because I got to tell that story. And other people were able to then, I actually went live with, and I did post the story. And that story has helped a lot of people. And so I think the number one, being able to talk to a friend about what's going on, and then when write that story. It doesn't have to be for public dissemination. You're writing yourself the story. But there'll be a year later, 10 years later, and hopefully you're still in aviation, you'll come back to that story, and you don't want that story to change. You don't want, because our tendency is as the story's told over time is to look back on the story, and there's little things that'll change. But that story will keep you straight. And so it keeps you personally straight, but it also helps you internalize that story of what happened. One of the things in aviation that I think is absolutely true is that it's inherently dangerous. I mean, aviation's not inherently safe. It's inherently dangerous. And it's down to those little small details. There's a great picture. I have it hanging up in my office. It says aviation is not inherently, let's see, how's it go? Aviation is in itself not inherently dangerous, but is totally unforgiving of the small errors. And that's it is totally unforgiving. For me, a brake check, and for me, prior to my engine breaking up in flight, or my engine literally breaking up, my engine was telling me it had a little small knocking sound that I had never heard before. But that knocking sound was the one little error that I should have never even flown that flight. And as I look back on it, that saved me many times from flying an airplane that I should never have flown. And so there's little tiny things that come out in the story. And in aviation, we're fighting for those little tiny nuances, because the little tiny nuances is what can eventually be. So for you, and I believe for me, I think we're good pilots. I think we beat ourselves up over these things. But there's little small things that can that can help us put the airplane in the ditch or bend the metal. And so those are things you can help yourself after the accident.
Well, I know for me personally, I'm not a very detailed person. I'm a big picture person. But I recognize that being a pilot is being precise. And early on, I'm flying by the seat of my pants and just, oh yeah, it's good. No. And I realized that was a weakness, and that I needed to fight for precision because it's against who I am by nature. So I think you're right. It's the little things. And, the cliche of the accidents being a chain, and
you got to break the chain.
You can break the chain, and you break it by the little things.
Can I say one more thing that I think is germane to my accident, and I say this to say that anybody has had an accident. For me, I had been flying the PA-46 for about 6 years, had been poured into by some great instructors. I had, gosh, I don't know, probably 1,500 hours in PA-46s. I had instructed others. I had had great instructors pour into me. I felt like I was at the top of the game of the PA-46. But when that crash occurred, there was something I didn't know. I didn't know that pressurized air from the cabin could get into a wheel cylinder, because the wheel cylinder is in the cabin. It's in the cabin itself. So this pressure that's in the cabin is trying to equalize itself through the path of least resistance. And if the path of least resistance is your left brake wheel cylinder, it will go there. And literally that's what happened, is the pressurized air went into the wheel cylinder, filled it with air, and so now whenever I pushed on the brake pedal, there was air there and not hydraulic fluid, or not brake fluid. And so I didn't know this, and I had, a lot of hours and important. It was the day that I decided I'm going to be a PA-46 instructor. And it was the day that I shifted gears from doing what I was doing and saying, I want to be this professional instructor that's going to tell people what they don't know. And in aviation, it's not knowing what you don't know is the thing that can usually end up hurting you. And I wanted to be that instructor that wasn't just going to give the big picture. I wanted to be an instructor that was going to tell the small nuances about this airframe to make people in this community really, really good. And that was the thing. I totally shifted career moves.
Because of the break.
Because of the accident. And there's my point, is that the accident, we don't always see what a negative thing happens, how the good that goes beyond it. But I've had a wonderful career in the PA-46 world that I wouldn't have had if I'd have not been in the ditch.
Oh, when I talk to people about the PA-46, your reputation is the master of the PA-46 airframe. So
Well,
you have achieved that for sure.
It's where I've spent. It's where I've spent a lot of my career now. But I would have been in the career in this area, but I would not have been. I would not become who I am today in terms of the PA 46 community and my impact into that community if it wouldn't have been for that accident. So the point is, what you think is a bad thing with time, and you've heard of this through so many aspects of life itself, over time, you'll find that big negative can be turned into a huge positive. It was the case for me. I entered a career that has been my beloved career with the PA 46 community. And, as long as I'm flying, I'll be here.
That's great. I think that's what you can take away. The big failure can define you, but not as a failure. It can define you as a success because you can turn it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And when you're the first day that you're in the ditch, the first day you've got an aircraft with you.
It's a dark place.
That's a dark, dark place, really, for quite some time until you come out of it. It won't happen overnight. It's gonna require writing and talking and letting time heal. Time is a great healer, and there's a great I don't know, quote probably is the right way to say it, but there's a great quote which is, distance lends enchantment to the view. I love that quote. I wish I could quote the person that said it. But the further you get away from something, the better it looks. And that occurs for just about anything. We always harken back to a time that was so good. Well, it wasn't that good. Your perspective of it looks back.
Changes.
There's an aircraft crash. If there's an aircraft crash in your life, time will be a healer. You will look back upon that crash, not upon all the negatives that occurred, but you'll look back upon the positives that came from that. With a mature time, with time and maturity, you'll look back on that. And hopefully you've got some friends, and hopefully you wrote about it, and hopefully you're able to work that out with other people, because we're people that need other people. And when you have an aircraft crash, you want some other people in your corner.
Yeah. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming on again.
Thanks for having me here. It's great to be here.
Okay, lots to take away from this one. And, I appreciate all you guys watching, and please visit our sponsors. We're going to list those. We're going to put them down below. And, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, watch some of the other videos, and we'll see you guys next time in the hangar.